All right, so the Russian Revolution, 1905, 1917, which one? Well, we're looking at more of the roads and the causes and some of the results. So let's just do a quick little history. So the Russian empire didn't really exist until much later. Remember, they were conquered by the Mongols first, and then they had this, Ivan the Terrible, kind of unifying some of Russia and taking it back from the Mongols. But it wasn't until 1613, for about 300 years, the Romanov family controlled it, and they were the last dynasty in Russia ever to exist. And under their rule, and for those 300 years, they expanded the empire east, and really, it went all the way from Germany, Poland area, all the way over to the Koreas, still the biggest country today by landmass. And also pointing out, 1905 is about the area of time we're looking at. It had 125 million people. It was larger than the U.S. by population as well, by quite a bit. So just kind of real quick, you don't need to write necessarily any of that down. All right, so let's look at the social structure. So there was a Russian monarchy, obviously. That was the Romanov family. They called it, the leader of it was a czar. Now it's spelled two different ways, so you're going to see me go back and forth between the two, so don't get too confused. But the czars prior to this time were Peter and Catherine. They recognized that the Russia needed to westernize. They saw Europe westernizing and modernizing, but not fully. They couldn't westernize. They couldn't have the same industrial revolution education systems because it really undermined the ruling class and serfdom. So you got to remember, this is an agrarian society, and that is based, basically farming, right? And that's based on that peasants were bound to the land, kind of like we've seen in so many other places, right? Peasants were bound to the land, and nobles owned the land, and they were basically, pretty much slaves, right? You were bound to the land. If you're a family, if you're born here, you were part of this land, you come with it. Kind of sounds like some of the systems we had in South America, right? So nobles rejected change because they didn't want to lose their privilege and ownership of the land and the people. And, nobility only took 2% of the or it was only 2% of the population, and peasants made up 98%. So there were very, very few people in the middle class. And so they didn't industrialize and westernize because nobility kind of pushed back on this idea that they didn't want to lose their privilege. And we know that, when we do go through industrialization, people move away from agrarian areas into factories and whatnot. But this middle class doesn't exist yet. All right. So this is Alexander II. He ruled from 1855 to 1881. That's not when he was alive. That's when he ruled. Okay. So we're going to talk about Alex, and we're going to talk about Nicholas. Okay. So they're two separate people, but it's all under the same Romanov family. Okay. So he lost the Crimean War, he came into power during the Crimean War, and they lost, and they knew this was, I shouldn't say they knew it was going to happen, but they were not industrializing like the other countries, not as quickly at least, and they didn't have like a railroad. This was a big reason they lost the war. They couldn't move their troops around, supplies and whatnot, and this is one of the big reasons they lost. They were still relying on horses and carriages when others had trains. So this really, they recognized that they needed to make reforms. And so there was an emancipation of serfs in 1861, meaning they weren't attached to the land anymore. But they had to buy land, and that was a point of contention because a lot of them couldn't afford it. They were very poor, so that didn't make much sense. They did establish some zemstvos, something like that. They were local elected bodies, so think of like a local government, for example, to take care of roads and farming issues and things like that. He also reduced censorship. Again, this is all under Alexander II, so he's making these changes. Reduced censorship and reduced military service and harsh discipline. Okay, so losing the war, recognized we need to make changes, we need to modernize, westernize. But he was still assassinated by the people that wanted change, even though he was making changes. So in 1881, revolutionaries, or you can call them terrorists, however you want to look at it at that point in time, assassinated him because even though he was a reformer, they wanted it done faster. and this was a mistake. Just cutting off the head of the snake isn't gonna fix it, because his son takes over and he makes it much worse. So we're gonna see a series of czars that resist change. So we had change occurring, but at a slow rate. But now we're gonna see a lot of pushback. So Alex III, that'd be his son, ends reforms and starts the more autocratic rule. All right, so in 1881, Alexander becomes czar and ends the reforms his father had in place, all the ones that seemed to be a good idea from over here, local control, they could, emancipation of serfs and reduce censorship and whatnot. He ended that, okay? Alexander, he institutes autocratic rule. He suppresses all opposition and dissent, and opposition, whether it be a people or, whether it's political or cultural, class. So he represses non-Russians. He creates a secret police to spy on people, whether they're in school or in the workplace. He puts censorship on any sort of critic, and then exiles critics to Siberia, which is a very harsh part of Russia, to do labor. So this is where we start to see some anti-Jewish discrimination. Let's face it, there was anti-Jewish discrimination for before this and much more after in the 20th century. But this really takes the focus off the Tsar in the 1880s. We see this through history. When leaders don't want the public focusing on them for the problems, they shift the blame. It's them. It's the Jews, or it's the Mexicans, or it's the black people, or it's the Christians or the Catholics, or whatever minority it is. You see that happen. Different leaders at different times of history. So it takes the focus off of him. Jews become target of government-backed pogroms. This is violent mob attacks against Jews. This is supported and backed by the government. Alexander III encouraged Jews immigrations to he encouraged emigration, meaning leaving, to the United States. And so if you ever watch The Fiddler on the Roof, this was set at this time, okay? And a lot of Jews did come to America, and some went to Europe as well. And so we do see Russia is trying to industrialize at this time. It's slow, though. So it's rapid in a way, but it's slow because it didn't really start until too late. Japan was super good and quick at it, but it was a different ruler and a different culture and different people. But anyways, they do double factories over this 40-year period, but it's still far behind other European countries. In the late 1800s, new plan boosts steel production, and they wanted to start building railways. Why is that important? It's so important because you have to connect your natural resources of your country to your factories to be able to produce goods and be competitive. But in 1894, Nicholas II, he becomes emperor, son of Alexander. And he continues to be like his dad when it comes to cultural and social issues. He focused on economic development, which business leaders and factory owners liked and appreciated. But the nobles and peasants still resist this because, again, nobles being the landowners and the peasants don't necessarily like this either, because what we happen is during industrialization, again, we have urbanization, so we have poor working conditions, disease, overcrowding, poor work conditions, and very little pay. So it seemed like a great opportunity in Europe. So it's very much like that, right? But the working conditions might even be worse, and it's people aren't really happy. It seems like really early on when people move to the factories and stuff, it takes a while for reforms to happen and working conditions to improve. So at this time, it's a point of contention. It's not good for poor people, all right? But they did start to build the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and we see Russia build more railroads after that. But it was, again, much, much later than the rest of Europe. So we see this revolutionary movement grow. Workers demand better pay and conditions. The factory life is not what they thought it would be. And so there's this discontent with people. Also, there's a growing popularity of Marxist ideas that the proletariat, so that's the workers, should be the rulers, okay? And this idea continues to grow and grow, okay? And just we're going to get into this at a later chapter, but we have a group called the Bolsheviks. They're the Marxists who favor revolution. So they're a minority. They're growing, but they're minority still, though, in the country. We actually see some of our young revolutionaries here of Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky. I forget his name, sorry. And then, so this is in 1905, so we're coming right up to the revolution. In 1905, a lot of these workers, they're upset. They come to the Tsar's palace to demand reform. The army fires into the crowd and just kills hundreds, if not thousands of people, and this is just a massacre. It wasn't, the people who are protesting wasn't necessarily going to get violent, but it ends up being violent. And they're fired upon. And it really led to a lot of, what do you want to say, like distrust of the government, okay? And so this leads to Nicholas to make a lot of reforms. That, and probably the last kind of final straw, was the Russo-Japanese War. We learned about this last chapter, but Russia's defeated. Russia's this huge power, biggest population, and they're defeated, and it's just a huge embarrassment. So there is a revolution, not the way you think of as in like, the emperor is taken down and a new government's formed. It's not like that. It's more government reform because of these defeats and because there were protests, because there was a massacre. We see a revolution in that way. So in 1906, the Duma is established by the Tsar. It's basically like a parliament, and they met in 1906. Now, the Tsar, was okay with this. This is part of and its new constitution. But it's, again, same Tsar, Nicholas II, still there. He dissolves the Duma after 10 weeks due to criticism. All right, so you can already see that these people aren't right in line with him. And so the Duma actually does continue to meet over the next 11 years. With limited power, basically. They actually do gain more power over time, but the Tsar is really still head of state, okay? And so kind of leading up to the next revolution. So 1905 is like the dress rehearsal of the 1917 revolution, where it just goes, it's a huge revolution and changes everything about Russia. I shouldn't say everything, but, they go from having a Tsar to, communism or Marxism with Lenin. But going back just a little bit though, so we have Tsarina. So that is that's Nicholas II's wife. All right, Tsarina Alexandria, right? Nicholas goes off to fight World War I. That's begun. So he actually left in 1915 to go fight in World War I, not fight, but take command basically. And so Tsarina is left there as the empress. And she falls under the influence of Rasputin. He's this mysterious holy man. I mean, he was actually around before this, but he was there still at that time. So again, like you saw in the video, she thought he could heal his son who had a blood condition. Basically don't listen to the doctors, and that was actually a good thing because he was getting aspirin, causing him to bleed. But just by doing that, he seemed better. And Rasputin is, again, I don't want to go too much into his life. Super interesting guy. I hope you watched the video and everything. He's actually the bad guy in Anastasia, the Disney movie, but that's totally wrong. Anastasia did not live. She definitely died with her family. They actually, it's more of a recent thing. In the 2000s, they actually did some DNA testing and said, yes, this is her body. She died with the rest of her family. If you didn't watch the Disney movie, you didn't miss much. Probably don't go watch it. But he's a bad guy in a Disney movie, so that's pretty cool, right? But yeah, nobles feared Rasputin because he had this influence over the royal family, especially the empress, and it really divided their government, the ruling aristocrats. And so so they feared him, and anyways, they ended up killing him, which assassinated him, plotted his murder. And a lot of actually peasants didn't like this either. They did see him as a holy man, but it depends on your view of who he is, I guess. But anyways, the army loses effectiveness under Tsarina as well, and people at home are hungry and unhappy, and this just leads to more discontent as well. All right. So now you don't take notes after this part. Just listen to this because it kind of leads you up to 1917, the revolution. But we're actually going to come back to that in later chapters. But just kind of summarize where we're going here. I think it's important to see. So the Tsar is basically abusing his power. There's Bloody Sunday, where all these people are shot, right? People have bad living conditions, they're poor, and people just don't trust government. Then we have World War I. They're losing the war, right? The revolution actually happens during World War I, is still continuing. A lot of soldiers are killed. They have poor weapons and ammo, not enough supplies, so their casualties are much higher than other countries that are fighting. And Tsarina does a poor job at home with Rasputin and just her rule in general. And then there's food and fuel shortages. So there's a lot of starvation. There's bad winter, and people are dying. So those three things really led to Vladimir Lenin's basically takeover of Russia. And we're going to see that in 1917. But essentially, he has this communist party, the Bolsheviks, and they overthrow the Tsar. He's kind of the king, right? And he basically just preaches that I will give you peace, bread, and land. I will give you peace from the war. I will give you bread to eat, and I will give you land to farm. And this is a simple message, which a lot of leaders see. Like, simple messages seem to work, whether they be true or not. Whether he gives them peace, bread, or land, we'll come to see. These simple messages work pretty well, though, and we're gonna see this in a later chapter. Okay. All right. Hope you enjoyed that.